Okay, welcome. I am Dr. Anna Smith, and I'd like to welcome you to our final fall session of the 2025 Creatively Critical Tech Research Design Practice Speaker Series. So if you've joined us for one of our other talks, you've already heard this multiple times, but I'd like to start with some introductory remarks to let you know where we're coming from and who we are. And while I make those, you are invited to let us know who you are in the chat. There's a chat button that's on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then over on the side, it will pop up, and you can let us know where you're joining us from, who you are, and what brings you here tonight. And so while you do that and introduce yourselves there, I'll start with our introductory remarks. So the Creatively Critical Tech series comes to us from the Education Now Lab at Illinois State University in the School of Teaching and Learning. And the Education Now Lab is a community-engaged research practice lab that uses immersive and emerging technologies to inquire, produce a range of critical, interdisciplinary, public, academic, new media scholarship with and alongside community members as we work toward more just educational futures. And I will drop in a few links for places where you can find our previous sessions, recordings of our previous sessions, and more about the lab and engage with us moving forward. So this particular series is sponsored through an Advancing Research and Creative Scholarship Tier 2 grant from the Illinois State University Office of Research, and we thank them for their support. And we also want to recognize the continuous ways that our work at Illinois State University is supported by histories of dispossession that have allowed for this growth of our institution over the last 160 years. And we specifically want to highlight the harm that is inflicted in our institution being built on the land and waterways of multiple indigenous nations who were forcibly removed, including the Illini, the Peoria, and the Miami. And as we are continuing to see struggles and atrocities happening to people and lands in so many current events, we hope that for each of our sessions in the Education Now Lab, that we can dedicate the energies, the insights that we gain toward action, however is best for communal well-being, for communal flourishing moving forward. I'm going to turn the time over to my colleague, Dr. Natalie Shaheen, and for some remarks and to introduce our speaker tonight. I think we're still on mute. Oh, you can't unmute. Let me make you a co-host. Sorry. We changed the settings. Just a moment, everyone. My fault here. Okay. Just a second. Let's see. Thank you for your patience, everyone. There it is.
All right, there we go. Evening, everybody. Thanks, Dr. Smith. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I want to take a moment to recognize the passing of Alice Wong. Alice was a fierce activist and organizer in the disabled community. Her work informs my teaching and research and that of many other academics and activists. If you're not familiar with Alice's work, I urge you to read one of her books or her hundreds of articles. She was a prolific writer throughout her life. I'll drop a link in the chat here in a bit about Alice. She passed just this weekend. So now to introduce our speaker for this evening. So I've known this evening's speaker for many years through the blind community. Dr. Cynthia Bennett is a staff research scientist at Google. Cindy's research centers around human-centered AI and disability. I find Dr. Bennett's research fascinating and eagerly await each new publication. Most recently, I read a paper Dr. Bennett and colleagues presented at the Assets Conference entitled Modeling Accessibility, Characterizing What We Mean by Accessible. Found it fascinating. You should definitely check it out. I'm thrilled Dr. Bennett is able to join us this evening to share her thoughts on AI, disability, and accessibility. Over to you, Dr. Bennett.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the tribute to Alice Wong. Second, checking out her work. I want to confirm, do we have the slides ready?
Yes, they are now up.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, so as Natalie mentioned, I'm Cynthia. I identify as blind, so I have a kind of a personal connection to some of the work that I'll be presenting today. But in my day job, I'm a researcher in Google's human-centered AI and machine learning organization, where I have a bit of a cop-out title, so I could go very broad, and it kind of also describes what I do. So responsible disability representation and accessibility AI applications. So I primarily do research thinking about how is AI representing disability and what could be better, as well as if we apply AI to solve accessibility challenges, what are kind of ethical concerns or user needs that we need to keep in mind. Next slide. So to provide an agenda, I will do a little bit of background. Then I'll talk about two projects. So the first one concerns disability representation in text-to-image AI, and the second concerns the impacts of AI on audio description, which I'll define later if you are unfamiliar with that. Next slide. So we see different numbers here, anywhere from like 16 to 25%, but a lot of people worldwide have disabilities. And according to the World Health Organization, disabilities are mismatches when people's bodies and minds interact with environments that systemically limit their full participation. So notably, the World Health Organization recognizes that disability is not a medical or health issue on its own, but results through inaccessible environments and this systemic exclusion. And for some people, disability is also a culture and identity. So again, thinking back to Alice Wong, great example of someone who kind of documented and built kind of the disability justice advocacy and culture. Next slide. On this slide, I have a few statements about my research approach that I consider baselines. So generally, I do qualitative research. I learn detailed and specific lived experiences, using those to inform any of the recommendations I make about technology design. Another kind of condition of my research is that it's disability centered. And that means I believe people with disabilities are the experts on their own lives, what access and justice mean to them, and are excellent informants on societal level change that would improve accessibility and also kind of interrogate notions of ability or what is, quote, normal. And finally, I consider my research to be political. I believe that everyone has and is influenced by their position and their relationships with others and their environments. And I draw on Alison Kafer's political relational model of disability to make those arguments. And often I'm drawing on Virginia Braun and Victoria Clark's reflexive thematic analysis, which is a qualitative analytical technique that recognizes the researcher and everyone has an influence in how the research is done and interpreted. Next slide. So next I'll move on to the first project I'll describe for you tonight. It concerns disability representation in text-to-image AI. Next slide. There is a paper associated with this work that if you download the slides, which have been shared in the chat, there are a lot of hyperlinks throughout the deck. And this is called Toward Community-Led Evaluations of Text-to-Image AI Representations of Disability, Health, and Accessibility. And I did this work with a couple of my colleagues at Google. Next slide. So I'll be talking a lot tonight about representational harms. These are a subset of broader socio-technical harms. Thank you, Natalie, for sharing Allison's work. So representational harms concern beliefs about different social groups that reproduce unjust social hierarchies. There are different subtypes of representational harms, such as stereotypes, demeaning, erasing, or alienating people or social groups, denying people the opportunity to self-identify, and reifying essentialist social categories. So I'll be talking more about representational harms, and there's a few links to papers on this slide if you're interested in learning more. Next slide. So media has long misrepresented disability. So on this slide, I have a few examples. So you may have encountered some of these or others, but the Elephant Man, for example, the way his story is told and the way his body, the way he's portrayed in the media, kind of portray him as a victim. Or there's some media tropes that use disability to villainize. So the way Captain Hook, again, often through the way that people's bodies are portrayed or the costume or clothing, their movements or actions, play on kind of disability associated visuals or actions to communicate something negative, in this case, him being a villain. And then kind of on the other side of the equation, there's inspiration porn and objectification. So this image of a promposal where someone got media coverage and it went viral that they asked a wheelchair user to the prom. The focus, the disabled person is being objectified in this image, even if it seems positive, for the benefit of non-disabled people. So these are just a few examples of how we don't even need AI. Media is doing a great job of misrepresenting disability. And AI, kind of the commentary I'll make, is kind of unfortunately building on that and amplifying that. Next slide. Text-to-image generative AI is the form of AI I'll be talking about tonight. And you may have seen this before, but in this version, users input in a text prompt of what they want to see in the output image, and then out comes an image. There are a lot of more sophisticated and complicated tools like image-to-image AI or multimodal models. I am not talking about those tonight, just simply text-to-image AI. However, we probably would see some similar behaviors. Text-to-image AI, or T2I, is proliferating. There was an estimate last year that 34 million images were being generated per day. So lots of media to think about how it's representing people. Next slide. There is a huge and growing body of work on how AI shows bias, often replicating societal biases we are aware of. There are some examples of papers here regarding its demonstration of gender bias, ethnicity and nationality, racial bias, often kind of privileging white imagery, and also some work on disability bias, including another paper that I published that I'm not able to talk about tonight, but kind of goes into additional tropes that I won't have time to mention. Next slide. So with this background in T2I kind of exploding in popularity and this idea that AI is biased, media is bad representation, we asked some research questions. So first, what types of terms do people with disabilities and health conditions and accessibility needs, DHA, include in prompts to signal for such representations? So if we're going to evaluate disability representation, we need to know like what kinds of language people are using, because the model is then using those specifications to generate imagery, and we don't have any like systematic understanding of that. And as a note, we kind of broadened disability representation to include health conditions, understanding that not everybody who is impacted by health conditions identifies as being disabled. And the next question is, how do they, as in people with disabilities, evaluate representation while iteratively prompting for images? So one feature of text-to-image AI is you can iterate on prompts. So you can generate one image and decide, what you like or don't like about it and submit successive prompts. Next slide. So our methods are that we recruited 21 people with diverse disabilities and health conditions, and they generated and evaluated T2I images in this study. I will share with you their self-chosen pseudonyms. They were randomly assigned to prompt with two text-to-T2I models at the time of our study. Gemini was not generating images, so that is why it is missing, but we used a version of Stable Diffusion and DALL-E that were current at the time of data collection. So participants wrote and edited the prompts with their preferred language, and this differs from previous work in that a lot of evaluation research, the evaluators see the output images, and we really wanted participants to have control over this end-to-end. And then they could edit prompts as many times as they wanted. And we engaged in semi-structured interviews to ask for feedback. So what did they expect to see when they give a prompt to the model? What was their positive and negative feedback? How the images could be improved, and if so, they could choose to edit the prompt to hopefully enact those improvements. Next slide. So I know a lot of you do community engaged research, so I wanted to share, I believe that accessible research procedures are a foundation of conducting inclusive research, which unfortunately is not predominant even in my field of accessibility. So I wanted to just share a few of the things that we did. So at the time of our study, some of the T2I models did not fully conform to known web accessibility best practices. So we chose to enter prompts for our participants. So they verbally shared their prompts, so they could type them in the meeting, the remote conferencing tool chat. So this, like, in a way, took agency away from participants. However, we accepted the trade-off because we wanted their feedback on the representations, and we didn't want the tools inaccessible content to get in the way of that. And so we engaged in a very slow and careful process to ensure that we edited and refined the prompts before we submitted them on behalf of participants. The other thing is, participants could choose how many times they prompted or if they wanted to move on. We did this to try to minimize time constraints as people worked at different paces, or maybe if a topic was particularly negative, they could kind of choose to move on. And the next thing is we provided image descriptions, captions, and ASL when needed. And I point this out because a lot of people are simply excluded from this type of research of like kind of silly things like how could a blind person evaluate images? So we wanted to make sure that everyone was able to participate. Next slide. So I'll share some findings in a few different a few different themes across what we found. So first is the categories of representation terms that participants entered. The second is I'll point out a few intersectional representational tropes that we found. And finally, I'll talk about the impacts of, so prompt engineering is a jargon term referring to that iterative prompting process, the impacts of the prompt engineering process on participants' evaluations. Next slide. So this slide has a really big table of just the many categories of terms that we inductively coded. And so this is not like a large scale giant study. We would definitely need to kind of validate these terms. But the point of this slide is that a lot of my colleagues in like natural language processing, they may use term lists that in my experience are quite limited. So often if disability is considered in large scale model evaluations, they might include terms like such as a person with disabilities or a person who is blind. And those are general disability terms, but participants actually used a variety of terms to specify for different disability representations. For example, sometimes they named a health condition like a person with chronic migraine or a person living with HIV. That for that use case is the appropriate term to describe that experience. Other people talked about symptoms or function descriptions. So a photo of a runner with ankle weakness, that's how this person was describing their symptoms during a run that they wanted to depict, or a photo of someone getting overstimulated. People prompted further access technology and medical equipment. So that could be a young cane user in a mosh pit, or that could be, wheelchairs, mobility canes, you name it. There was also accessible communication, including American Sign Language, accessible environments, things such as, disability-friendly apartment building, or wanting to see like infrastructure that was accessible. Accessible activities. So this is interesting as some participants had expectations about the way general activities were shown if they were paired with a disability term. So for example, if prompting for something like disabled people doing yoga, the action of yoga to participants would need to be depicted in an accessible manner. So when disability qualified activities, that affected how they expected those activities to be depicted. And there were also community and activism, such as like disability advocates at a rally. So this just shows like an incredible vast amount of terms that people use to talk about disabilities that are not usually represented when we kind of evaluate for it. Next slide. Just a couple of follow-ups. So participants wanted to find nuanced reality over tokenistic presence. So thinking back to that promposal, so Maria, a participant, prompted a photo of disabled people doing yoga. This image shows people in wheelchairs on yoga mats. There's very kind of homogenized body presentations. And so to Maria, this is kind of a tokenizing, actually unrealistic portrayal that you would not see accessible yoga being done in this manner. And similarly, in another of her prompts, asking for disability advocates at a rally, this shows wheelchairs that are on stairs, which is completely unsafe and unrealistic. Again, the presence of a marker of disability is in the image. However, it's not a genuine representation, and therefore it's still a bad representation. Next slide. Participants, in addition to using all those categories of terms, wanted to see very diverse and intersectional representations. So this example of a prompt, a pregnant person of color with a disability playing with their family. So this has, a lot of, it has, pregnancy status, race, ethnicity, an action kind of, and also someone with their family. So this is just an example of a few of the many types of things that participants wanted to see coinciding with kind of disability specifications. Next slide. But even though participants were interested in seeing this diversity, we found several representational harms that intersected with other forms of oppression. So disability was often conflated with whiteness. Participants identified upper class defaults, and those are just a couple I'll share with you. Next slide. So disability was often conflated with whiteness. Pretty much oftentimes all the images were of white people unless participants requested like a diverse group or a specific race. And Yvonne kind of related this to other media. She said, Black and brown people don't usually show up in the disability stuff when I'm searching for it generally, even with chronic illness and disabilities, which often happen in mostly Black and brown communities. And as an example, AO, a different participant, requested a photo of a person with chronic migraine. And AO said, yeah, this tracks with ads I've seen of migraine medication. It's usually a white suburban mom. So this image of a white woman who's in pain. So participants identified that disability was often depicted with white people, and this was not representative of their experience. Next slide. Participants also identified an upper class default in that images, particularly of homes, also when they specified for accessible homes, tended to be very modern, urban, and spacious. And LSF kind of identified, he said, for the T2I tool, it looks like this is the ideal kitchen, but not everyone has this kind of kitchen, honey. And so this kitchen, which is kind of nicer, suburban, did not represent the type of home. LSF actually had to like put the word poor in his prompts to kind of tone the imagery down. And there's some interesting questions that come up in terms of the tensions around representing a reality that's not necessarily positive and reproducing other stereotypes, kind of showing the limits of like imagery on its own as a form of representation, in the sense that if there were images of people with disabilities and poverty, that would also kind of reproduce other stereotypes in certain ways and also represent reality in others. So there were kind of tensions when participants identified these defaults. Next slide. So now we'll talk about the process of prompt engineering, which largely did not improve the image quality. So successive prompts often did not correct inaccuracies, and successive images could re-render defaults. Next slide. So to describe that successive prompts didn't correct representations. So wheelchairs were quite predominant in images, even when participants specified for invisible disabilities. One person, Tony, prompted 8 times iteratively to try to get rid of wheelchairs using phrases like wheelchair, no wheelchair, or wheelchair equals 0. Gargi, a different participant, said, let's just give up on not showing a wheelchair. And so participants found it, frustrating and distressing when they specified for something to be removed and were unable to do that. Another inaccuracy was the depiction of canes. So Jonathan has low vision, and he wanted to depict a mobility cane, which he specified for. And on his third prompt, he was still receiving images of a person using like a support cane that maybe someone with mobility disabilities would use. And so the models were unable to use like context clues such as visually impaired or walking or mobility cane to render the right access technology, and even subsequent prompts did not improve the images. Next slide. Successive images could re-render defaults. So back to LSF, who wanted to depict kind of very multicultural and diverse family scenarios. And his first image depicted two white people. And then he added multicultural background to his prompt. And his second image had people of two different races. He wanted to add some age diversity. And in the third image, although multicultural background is still in the prompt, the third image shows two white people again. And so through these kind of iterations, again, a lot of evaluations think about the output imagery. So if we show you these images, how do you evaluate the representation? But through the process of actually engaging with models and producing the representations, the harms could kind of be extended in the sense that, you know, it happening once, okay, but when the user is giving specific instructions and finding either inaccuracies are not resolved or images get worse, that kind of adds to the harm that is experienced. Next slide. So as T2I advances, disability, health, and accessibility representation lags. Representations were rather tokenistic and non-diverse, and kind of successive prompts did not improve image quality. Next slide. So what are kind of some paths forward? I think there's a lot here, but one thing we wanted to emphasize in this study is that evaluations not only concern like the outputs, AI outputs, but also the whole pipeline. So what are the terms that participants are using in prompts? How can we use those to collect better data and engage in better model training? And so developing those term lists and things like evaluation, in addition to evaluation criteria with communities, is imperative. Also, iterative prompting as an evaluation method really did enrich our data. We were able to get a little bit of a snapshot of not just like a one-time experience, but how these harms are experienced through an entire like end-to-end interaction. And so I recommend, I don't know if it would be relevant for any of your research, but I found that it really did enhance and extend, give us more opportunities to ask follow-up questions for feedback, et cetera. And then there's certain things that are kind of targeted more toward like natural language processing. So AI did not do a great job at interpreting user prompts, things like being unable to interpret negation language for things like no wheelchair. So there's a lot of opportunities to kind of better align how these systems are interpreting user prompts. And so that is the end of this project description. And I accidentally dropped my notes, so I gotta grab those. But I'm curious if we want to kind of go through to the end of the talk or like pause for some questions now. I could go either way.
Yeah, we could see if there's questions on this particular project that people have, and then we can transition to the next one. Do you want to do that?
Sure.
Okay.
That's totally fine, as long as somebody's managing the time.
Yeah. Okay, I'll watch that. Thank you. We could take a couple questions if you have those.
Or I know sometimes people need time to process, so that's like
Mhm.
also fine if we just want to move on.
Yeah, so at any time, if you want to drop a question in the chat, or there's a Q&A, I think I made that available as well. And I will go ahead and share those out with you. But Dr. Shaheen, did you have a question?
Yeah, just quick. So, Cindy, I remember when I read this paper when it first came out, I was very interested in the DHA acronym. I thought it made sense to me why you would,
Yeah.
broaden that. But I was curious if you pulled that acronym from elsewhere because I hadn't seen it before.
Oh,
So,
we made it up, and I think it's a mouthful. So what the motivation, and I was going very fast. I do recommend like the slides have like really good alt text, and the slides also have links. So where this came from, so Sami Shock is disability scholar who published a book called Black Disability Politics. And her book really emphasizes what a lot of, I think activists have tried to emphasize but haven't been heard, is how other kind of social movements have often contributed to disability, but in ways that maybe don't always use the same language. So for example, this book has chapters on how the Black Panthers supported the disability rights movement and did a lot of like local advocacy, but are often not credited. And so from that scholarship, understanding that not everyone who is impacted by ableism identifies as disabled kind of motivated us to expand to disability health conditions and accessibility, but I acknowledge that it's a mouthful. One of the ways that we did this in our recruitment was we recruited from disability independent living centers in New York City, but also an LGBTQ community center. And I would have loved to recruit from other community centers. At the time, that was the access that I had. But in order to like access populations of people who maybe don't identify, we have to kind of recruit creatively.
And we have one more question. That two are that they're similar from Sinai and
Yeah.
Mia. They both are asking about AI and AI understanding culturally specific language norms. So how would like the idea is how do we go about making that change that AI can understand, quote unquote, understand culturally
Mm-hmm.
specific language norms and respond in the way that we're hoping for?
Yeah, so I think there are different answers to this question. And also, I'm not sure if any of us have the right answer. So, some different approaches that are often suggested are like expanding the data that the model is trained on. So, a lot of the large language or large models are trained from data scraped from the internet, Wikipedia, Reddit, all sorts of like corners of garbage that you wouldn't imagine. And so that impacts, like that data impacts what the model learns. There are different techniques of model training where you can emphasize, or like you could put rules on what the model can or can't output, and then you could also like emphasize certain data. So there might be dedicated data collections in certain cultural groups. I've seen some of these going on in research communities, like working with a community directly and then trying to get that data set incorporated into model training. There's also another philosophy of like large general purpose models are never going to serve everyone. They do a mediocre job at being general purpose. And if you want models to do a really good job at something more specific, the better thing to do is to kind of train smaller models on like to be really good at specific things. I think in our landscape where large companies are kind of dominating this design space, there's not such an incentive to do that, but that is kind of a philosophy. And then there's kind of another side of it that's like, there's certain things that maybe AI like is not the best at, right? Cultural knowledge, maybe that's better transmitted through other means of like oral histories or real people or whatever. I think there's definitely trade-offs in the sense of the way that these models can scale. However, there's these costs that we're talking through. So in that sense, things like accompanying images with prompts and metadata so that users have more context into maybe what the prompt was going for, or providing other access to information to go along with the image so users can better evaluate whether it's an appropriate representation or not. So kind of these singular modal outputs, like just an image, might not have enough information for users for them to really benefit users. It's kind of another take. But lots of open questions there. I think there was another question in the chat, and I don't, if someone could reread it, that would help. That was a little bit more general.
Yeah, there's one that's around, do you know that if AI, the models you looked at were portraying white people at the same rate in prompts without disability? So is this bias similar within disability prompts or without? Do you know that?
Yeah. So I didn't do that research, but some previous papers, they did something different called sentiment analysis. And there's a technique called perturbing. And I'm explaining these in very very bad ways. You could read whole textbooks. But there's an experimental technique where you can feed a model you can feed it sentences that are like basically the same, but they're not the same. So but the thing that changes is what you're testing. So you could say like Cindy is a blind woman and she has a job, blah, blah, blah. And then you could say something like Cindy is like you'd fill it in with some innocuous word, or just say a woman. And there are kind of like some models that you can ask the model, what is the sentiment of this sentence? And there's a couple of studies that showed that sentences, the same sentence with disability words as compared to the sentence that doesn't have disability words, had like a more negative sentiment as classified by the AI, right? So that I think is evidence that the bias is related to disability. It's not like every type of specification would be receiving the same treatment.
Yeah. All right. Interesting. Okay, I'm watching the time for us.
Okay, so
we can move on to the next project, and then we'll take some more questions.
Sure.
If you still have questions, you can still add them, and we'll get to them at the end. All right.
Awesome. So on the agenda slide, I'll move on to a project on the impacts of AI on audio description. Next slide. This paper is called Made by People, Described by People, the Changing Work Practices of Audio Description Professionals. I also wrote this article with some colleagues at Google, and we've just submitted our proofs. So it's not online, but will be within a month. And so what I want to point out is, whereas the previous project was concerning with AI outputs that were specifically about disability, I'm switching gears here to talk about when AI is applied to solve an accessibility problem, what are kind of the things that maybe we would want to think about as that automation is developed, that would ensure that audio description stays high quality and is human-centered. Next slide. So what is audio description, or AD? AD narrates important visual details in videos, often inserted during gaps in dialogue. And so on this slide, there is an image, and there's kind of a speech bubble that shows what a line of AD could be. In this example, the line of AD says, number 3 on the red team gets control of the ball. And this is an image of a soccer match going on. AD, you can check it out on your favorite streaming service. So oftentimes streaming services have a setting. So if you go to the playback settings, like kind of similar to where if you turned on subtitles, there can be AD or audio options, and you can see if there's an audio description track, and I encourage you to turn it on, and you might enjoy it. So audio description is key for making videos accessible to blind and low vision audiences, so that they have access to that visual content that is otherwise unavailable. Next slide. So AD is under available, and I think like there's like millions in the paper. We have numbers. There's like millions of videos released every year, and there's this audio description project that accounts for all the videos with AD available in the US, and there's like 13,000 entries. Okay, so like AD is very under available, and there's a lot of enthusiasm in accessible research communities to automate AD because that could scale its availability. This slide has a lot of examples of how automation could potentially help with the production of AD. It gets a little bit in the weeds of technical stuff, but you could fully automate audio description. You could use automation to help professionals identify gaps in dialogue and how much script can fit. You could use AI to refine human AD, like suggest shortens or cuts. So there are a lot of different things that automation AI could do to potentially help. And this would be kind of through thinking about what we talked about in the last presentation. This would be maybe somewhat opposite. The model is ingesting a video or potentially a script and outputting, text recommendations or other recommendations to help refine the AD. Next slide. AD's professionalization has been refined for decades. It's a very human process, and lots of advocates have worked really, really hard both to get the professionalization, the skills recognized as such, and to advocate that AD is available and that the professionals are paid for their work. So there's the Audio Description Project I mentioned, which is a catalog of available AD that's also provides a lot of resources. There's lots of AD training retreats, and there's groups, activist groups like the Social AD Collective that I'll talk about later, that try to ensure that like blind people are involved in its development. And so there's a lot of resources and advocacy that have been working together for decades and to establish AD as a human thing. Next slide. So AD professionals are experts with behind the scenes perspectives on, the writing of AD, quality checking or QC, narrations, and production of AD. So we wanted to center AD professionals in this study because it, not anything against users, but the professionals also kind of have this behind the scenes understanding of how AD is developed and will have unique insights on like what automation, what impact that would have. Next slide. So in this study, we ran semi-structured interviews with AD professionals, 17 professionals with varying and often multiple expertise. So maybe somebody wrote AD scripts, but also was a narrator. Importantly, 8 participants were blind or low vision, BLV. And this, again, unfortunately, in my field matters because believe my paper, I think I saw a published poster about blind and low vision AD professionals, but my paper really emphasizes that blind and low vision people are professionals in this field, and we'll talk about some of the problems they're encountering. And so we wanted to make sure that when we're talking to the experts that a subset of them are actually also blind or low vision. We asked them questions about their background and training in AD. We also asked them to share a canonical workflow. So in the different ways that could support AD professionals, we wanted to understand, okay, like what do they actually do to produce AD, including the parts of the process that are either accessible or not accessible. And then we asked questions about changing norms in the field that they're noticing and their perspectives on AI and AD. Next slide. So I'll share our findings in a few different areas. The first is on creating AD, the AD workflow, work around the work, and accessibility barriers. And then I'll talk about perspectives on and changing norms around culturally competent and blind-centered AD, as well as automation and AD. Next slide. So live theater and recorded media AD, we kind of developed this canonical workflow, and this is not the workflow that everybody goes through, but we made a diagram to try to say like kind of at a high level. So we synthesize kind of the typical workflow for this kind of includes both people who produce AD for recorded media, which is like the movies and TV shows I was talking about earlier, as well as live theater. So if a blind person goes to like a Broadway show, they could also experience AD by kind of checking out a headset and listening to it. So first, program managers and like freelancers would review an AD contract that they receive, and PMs on teams would delegate the work if multiple professionals will be involved. They'll often with the contract get some reference materials from the media provider, and there was high variability in what these consisted of, but if there are reference materials, this is where they would come in. Then writers develop a script, and the primary reference materials that they would use include the media to be described, so like the actual video or attending rehearsals, including anything available such as like character lists or key names and phrases, and also style guides. So style guides is a big one where companies would have restrictions on how to describe their logo, or you can say these words but not these words, and participants had to kind of negotiate these different requirements for different companies. Participants sometimes, so some stages always happen, like writing always happens, and sometimes after writing, there's kind of a quality control phase on the script, often with peers or coworkers. When the script is finalized, it will either go to a TTS, like a text-to-speech narrator, which we'll talk about, or a human narrator. The narration is complete, and then there might be another quality control loop to assess like the audio quality, make sure all the writing makes sense. And at these quality checkpoints, the diagram, the workflow could loop back if something needs to be rewritten or re-recorded. After the recording is complete, then the AD is produced, it's mixed with the original media, and then it's kind of finished. Next slide. So while I went through a typical workflow, we learned that there's a lot of what we call work around the work. So for example, though often time constrained, writers often consulted several reference materials, including conducting, reverse image searches to describe specific locations accurately. Some use generative AI to come up with word lists like synonyms to vary their language in similar descriptions. BLV participants often would hire a visual interpreter to ensure that they understood all the important visual details. So for example, B15 mentioned that he hired a visual interpreter, and he said, I would share an SRT file with this sighted person. So an SRT file is actually the file type that is used for captions. And so B15, there's no such equivalent for AD. So B15 was actually appropriating this captioning file format and annotating the captions of the dialogue with his questions. So he would say, at this timestamp, what happens here? Because there's this very interesting sound. What visual thing is showing at this moment? And so blind participants had a very kind of refined and expert way of engaging with visual interpreters to kind of get the key information and then use their talent as writers to develop the script. Next slide. However, consulting with the creative team was sometimes necessary, though it was rarely available. So I love this example. The character Venom from Spider-Man actually didn't have pronouns. So in all the Spider-Man media, Venom was just never referred to in dialogue in such a way that required pronouns. And so S16 was a writer on a video game with Venom. And luckily, she was able to talk to the creative team, thinking that developing a pronoun was something that the creators really needed to weigh in on. And she said, previously, this was something that the team had never had to think about. So Venom is this kind of symbiote where the host's pronoun at the time was him. And the symbiote, they decided to call it it, and together it is they, them. And so this is an example of how, audio description is not just a functional accessibility provision, but sometimes results in kind of creative decision-making that needs to happen that affect the entire media. Next slide. BLV participants also reported accessibility barriers and workarounds that they developed. Inaccessible tools, reduced opportunities. So B11 reported that a certain company uses software that has not been accessible to screen readers. And so if you are blind, you would not be able to work on any of that company's projects. So participants encountered some show-stopping barriers, even though they wanted to be more involved in the field. And in some cases, they could develop accessibility workarounds. So for example, B4 is a narrator and a QC professional. And she wrote a Python script which breaks up her narration lines into particular lengths that she knows she can voice in one go. And so this helps her to be able to narrate more efficiently, so she can just be reading or listening to one line at a time while narrating it. And B14 has also written some scripts to clean up spreadsheets and upload them into his digital audio workstation to make narrating easier and more accessible for him. Next slide. So now I'll transition to talk about perspectives on changing norms regarding culturally competent and blind-centered AD, as well as automation. Next slide. So a concept that came up frequently during our interviews was culturally competent and blind-centered AD. So this has two layers. First, the culturally competent part is that participants advocated for AD of people, environments, objects, or cultures that were kind of narrated in language that was appropriate to the media. So whether that's using the same language as the intended audience, using accurate language, and also the blind-centered part referred it to AD that was developed at least in consultation with blind people. And a great example of blind-centered and culturally competent AD that multiple of our participants looked to was Bridgerton. So Bridgerton is a period romance featuring a kind of a cast that is more diverse than the historic time period it represents. And so if you didn't know the race of the characters, given that it's Regency England, you might assume that they're white, but the creatives have intentionally chosen to diversify the cast, creating kind of this different representation. Also, Bridgerton is known for having adult content, and there's been kind of some history in AD development that is sometimes not described adult content, even during programming that is for a mature audience. And so this Bridgerton, actually, blind people jumped on Twitter when some of them found out that it was maybe missing some of these types of descriptions, and had some hashtags. I think it was like describe all the butts or something, like some silly hashtags. And actually Netflix and the audio description team re-recorded the audio description to be more appropriate. And so this is just an example of how the importance of cultural competence in the AD process, as well as a blind-centered process, can ensure that audio description is appropriate for the audience and respectful of the cultures that it's representing. Next slide. Participants often had to advocate for culturally competent and blind-centered AD. So such as for representation-wise, S13 runs an organization, and they actually have a requirement that every one of their AD teams has at least one blind or low vision professional. And B14, who is a narrator, has actually chosen to not record lines that he found were maybe inappropriate, used outdated language, and has used his power as a narrator to, in certain cases, re-record a new line instead. So he said, for one line, I said, this is a problem. And I just wrote them a note with it in there. I told them how I changed it, but I did not give them the original line. And so cultural competence in blind-centered AD remains not the norm and something that participants had to advocate for. Next slide. So now I'll share some positive impacts of AI on the AD development process. And so we'll notice that there's kind of different tiers of funding streams, and a lot of participants worked for commercial media companies where presumably lots of money is going into developing the media, and there was kind of a sentiment that similarly that AD should be top quality as well. S8 is an education accommodation specialist who had like no financial support and had to create AD for course videos. And so he used large language models to help him process course materials, such as videos and slides that he would get from the professor to generate initial AD scripts that he would verify. But he could also incorporate student preferences, such as if a student has low vision, maybe there's certain types of things they don't need described, or certain subjects that maybe they would prefer more concise descriptions or more verbose descriptions. He said, the LLMs have allowed me to put my ideas into code and try out different things in a way that previously I would have had to hire a developer. And so participants kind of shared that in cases where they had to produce kind of deliverables with no funding, in the case, unfortunately, of education, AI was a helpful workaround in order to accelerate that process where the student may not have received AD if they didn't leverage that. Participants mentioned some potential applications of AI. As I mentioned, style guide management could be very difficult if participants freelance for multiple companies. having a custom GPT, as one participant described, that they could say, hey, does this line conform to this style guide? Some of that administrative overhead participants were interested in offloading to automation. Next slide. So now I'll share some of the negative impacts of AI on the AD development process that participants have already found. So S9, it works for an organization and has lost bids to competitors that use AI voices. And she said, even after explaining how we work with BLV narrators and how we are plugged into communities and we get feedback, and that feedback changes our process. Even after explaining that, they would still get, they would still lose bids. And so they're noticing that automation is starting to squeeze the market and kind of lower competitive rates. Participants were also forced to kind of work with AI or text-to-speech voices. S9 also mentioned how she had to misspell the word grimaces 10 different times so that the AI voice would pronounce it correctly. She said a human narrator would know how to pronounce that word. AI voices are actually creating a new form of labor where AD writers have to experiment with how to write certain terms to ensure that they're pronounced correctly. Next slide. So in light of AI having a kind of bigger impact on information work, participants drew boundaries on what they considered as kind of acceptable use. So for example, participants agreed that, AD should align with the media quality. The title, quote, I'd like, if this movie was made by people, it should be described by people. S16's company would use AI voices so writers could test out listening to lines instantly and maybe make some adjustments, but that all of the actual narrators were real people. And S2 advocated, kind of calling back to the previous project, how human verification was necessary to verify kind of the cultural competence of AD, since AI models have been shown to not do very good at cultural representation. Next slide. So some takeaways and provocations. AI can support BLV professionals and AD users. However, it is already negatively impacting them. So kind of high budget media providers are choosing automation over quality, unfortunately. And so thinking about how kind of speaking to my field, how can we be supportive, create maybe automation in ways that are helpful while trying to mitigate companies choosing those options that are meant to help kind of lower budget. That's often a tough call, is that it becomes kind of out of your control if you put tools out in the world, how they end up getting used. Next slide. And some opportunities to improve AD tooling, a lot of opportunity that could improve accessibility barriers. Again, some of the tooling, participants were writing scripts to kind of improve the format of documentation they were receiving. A lot of that could be probably automated without much problem. And there's kind of this between space in the sense of, for kind of films that aren't super high budget, but could be very personalized in terms of creating like AD for students or other kind of individualized use cases. There's a real opportunity where AI could potentially create multiple scripts that conform to different kind of personalized style guides. Next slide. So that is all I have. Thank you so much. I know, oh my gosh, it's already the 30-minute mark. I'm happy to stay a little longer because I know I spoke longer than we initially agreed. But yeah, thank you so much for listening and asking questions.
Thank you so much. So much to think about.
Yeah.
Claps. So thank you. Thank you again. And if you don't mind, we can take a few minutes and take a final couple questions. I was thinking there at the end, right, going between automation and AI, there about some things could be automated, but they don't need necessarily AI, or some things that could use a generative AI. And are you finding some of those distinctions of where I feel like a lot of times people jump, okay, well, let's go do AI. And I'm like, well, you might just need, right? Maybe you just need a script, or maybe you just need a
Yeah.
macros or something that's not Gen AI, right?
Yes. Yeah, so I agree that there is like an obsession with throwing Gen AI at everything.
Hmm.
In terms of like how to mitigate that, I think that's kind of in the ballpark of us technology developers to ensure that we're really clear when we're building systems, like what approach we suggest and why we suggest it. And in that way, I think about like maximizing user agency and also, for something that could be scripted, it's like going to be correct. It's not going to, the AI is not going to like do it right the first time and wrong the second time. So I think that's kind of up to us and our kind of design specifications, but I don't know if that answers your question, but I just say I totally agree with you that um, generative AI does not need to be the solution, and oftentimes it's not the
Yeah.
best.
Yeah. And then and Dr. Sheen said that it seems like there's some parallels between AI for